What can we learn today from the history of the American Revolution? Rick Atkinson will be here to talk about his new book, The British Are Coming. How do you impeach a president? Brenda Wineapple will join us to talk about the Impeachers, the trial of Andrew Johnson, and the dream of a just nation. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Rick Atkinson joins us now. His new book is called The British Are Coming, The War for America, Lexington to Princeton, 1775 to 1777. Rick, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Pamela.
It's an interesting subtitle because, of course, it's not the American Revolution, but the War for America. What are you trying to signify with that?
Well, it's the war for America in the sense that not only is it a struggle for independence, but it's a question of who we're going to be. No one knows that it's going to be a republic, but they're thinking about what the shape of this new country that they're trying to effect should be. And if it's a civil war, of course, it's our first civil war, and it's pretty bloody. It's nasty. It anticipates the Civil War of the 19th century, and so it's a war for America in that sense.
How did you decide to write about this war, very different from the previous war you wrote about, World War II, in the Liberation Trilogy?
You know, I finished Volume 3 of the Liberation Trilogy. Spent 15 years writing about the American role in the liberation of Europe in World War II. And even before the book came out, I'm thinking, what do I want to do next? The obvious thing is to pivot to the Pacific and do for that campaign what I'd done for the Mediterranean and Western Europe. And I just didn't have the heart for it, partly because I would have had to start the war over again.
Right.
At Pearl Harbor. And I've just been fascinated with the story of our origins since I was a kid and the drama of it and the characters involved. And at this point in my life, I could decide to do what I wanted to do. And this is what I decided I wanted to do. I thought in 2013, when I started working on this, that it was important. It seems to me that it's more important than ever now to understand who we are, where we came from, what our forebears believed. And the most important question any people can ask themselves, what were they willing to die for?
So in that reference there, I'm taking it you're referring to the most recent election in 2016, and you were still working on this first volume then. Did that fundamentally shift what you were thinking about?
I don't think it did. The past is the past, Faulkner notwithstanding, but it gave me a sense of relevance because fundamental questions like whether there is truth or not, fundamental questions about how open our society should be, questions of executive power. Those were all raised in the 1770s. They've been with us ever since. Sometimes they're a little more pronounced than at other times, and this is one of those times when these fundamental questions about who the American people are and who they want to be seems to be in stark relief. So that has led me to think that this story is actually more relevant than I perhaps could have expected.
I mean, it does seem to be in the air, maybe just in my data set of one, because I think certainly for me, after the election results, I found myself going back to the founders and sort of rethinking it. And even in the context of 2016, I remember I was reading Walter Isaacson's biography of Ben Franklin, and I was watching that old HBO series Adams based on the McCullough biography, and which, of course, begins during the Revolutionary War period. And you look at it and you think, there are a lot of parallels between the American rebels at that time and Trump voters today.
It's true. They're insurrectionists. They have a sense of grievance. This isn't unusual in our history. I mean, this is a streak that runs from 1775 to 2019. There are parallels in the anti-establishment tenor of the Trump base. But I think that the patriots, if we can call them that, it doesn't presuppose moral superiority, but
right.
The rebels, in fact, are a wider base than Trump's base. I mean, one thing that I've now realized in spades is that the country was born bickering. Disputation is part of the national genome. And there is this sense of grievance, of reluctance to be under the thumb of people whom you perceive to be superior to you. They think they're superior to you. We see that in the rebels in the 1770s, and you see it in the Trump voters today.
But as you said, the past is the past, which I think leads to the question of, well, what is there new to say or new to know or to discover about the American Revolution?
Well, first of all, I think, all great events, just like all great people, are bottomless. People will be writing about Abraham Lincoln 500 years from now. They'll be writing about World War II 500 years from now. And the Revolution falls into that category. I try to tell this story almost as much from the British perspective as from the American. So the book opens with George III, our last king, riding to Portsmouth on the south coast of England for a great review of the Royal Navy. It's exactly 10 years after the creation of the first British Empire with their victory over the French and Spanish in the 7 Years' War, and trying to understand that perspective. So I was one of the first allowed in to review George's papers. The Queen, who owns them, Queen Elizabeth II, just has opened them up to scholars for a review. They're digitizing them. So I spent a month in Windsor every day climbing to the top of the Round Tower. And there are the papers. George was his own secretary until late in life when he began to go blind. And he wrote everything by himself. He wrote all his correspondence and the copies of his correspondence. You have a real tactile sense of being in his presence. And I think that having that perspective on it and understanding what the British thought they were doing in waging war for 8 years across 3,000 miles of ocean in the age of sail gives a fresh perspective on it.
Well, you kind of casually refer to having access to these papers, but it's a pretty amazing thing. And you embarked on this history before knowing that those papers were going to become available. Can you tell the story about how you found out?
Yeah. Well, I live in Washington, and I go to the Society of the Cincinnati for research. They have a wonderful library there, and usually the last person to have signed in before I'm signing in on this particular day is me, because there are usually not people there. One day I noticed that they'd had visitors, somebody from the royal household, somebody from King's College in London, and somebody from Windsor Castle. So I asked the librarian. She said, oh, yeah, they're here because the Queen is opening up the papers of George III, and they're looking for American partners. William and Mary turns out to be their partner. So I contacted William and Mary, and lo and behold, a couple months later, I'm in Windsor. One of the reasons that the British are doing this is because they had no idea what's in it. There are no finding aids. There's no index. So when I finished my month, I wrote them a long memo. I said, you got this, you got this, you got this. And they said, oh, wow, we didn't know that. That's fantastic.
Wait, no one looked at these papers?
So some of the papers have been looked at. Some of the correspondence with Lord North, for example, his prime minister, with the Sandwich, who's the head of the Admiralty. But things like the correspondence that George has with his children in some cases. I looked at the papers of Charlotte, his queen, this obscure, drab German princess, who's really interesting. She's very intelligent. I looked at the papers of the two eldest sons because they will both become king, and William is a Royal Navy lieutenant here in New York when the war is in its final stages. So people have looked at some of it. There's 350,000 pages. Most of it has never been published.
Wow. Why would it take them so long to open these up to the public?
The royal librarian, Oliver Urquhart Irvine, wondered the same thing. Part of it is that George III, there are 4 Georges, George III was king for 60 years, was in bad odor and still is to some extent. He's the guy who lost the colonies.
Right.
And he went crazy.
The mad King George.
Yeah, the madness of King George. And he's just not one of the favorites. His papers were in the cellar of the Duke of Wellington for a century. And they finally got them out, and they moved them to the garret of the Round Tower, basically. But there was not a whole lot of interest in it. He was kind of an afterthought when it came to British monarchs. And Oliver Urquhart Irvine persuaded the Queen that it would be a service to the nation, to the British nation, to pull these papers out, make them available, digitize them so that they're not in danger of being lost. And she bought into it.
At some point, we can all Google these pages and look them up. And
they're going to put them online. There'll be no paywall. You'll be able to get right at them.
How easy were they to handle, to read, to get through? I mean, you said 350,000 pages. I'm assuming you kind of flipped ahead to the relevant period.
Yeah, I'm looking for specific periods then. I'm less interested in the papers of young George before he becomes king in 1760. The papers are on the best paper that you can buy in the 18th century. Paper in those days was made from rags, and the ink is fantastic. It lasts forever, made from oak burls, I think. And George's handwriting is quite good, fortunately.
Lucky you,
yeah,
yes.
Lucky, because it's not always the case. And they're beautifully preserved in these big red binders that the British use for their official papers. And he just leaps off the page. You can see he had a knack. He's very compulsive. So he writes recipes for insecticide, for example. And he not only dates his correspondence, he puts to the minute the hour that he's written it. It tells you something about him. He writes theater reviews. He's a great theater goer, and so had a steely mien, a particularly effective Brutus. You really feel a man of parts when you read the papers, and you see why he's waging war, what he believes.
What does he believe? I mean, what did the colonies mean to him? It sounds like you can get a sense of his kind of emotional response as well as his intellectual response too.
You can, and you can see the strategic misconceptions that he and his ministers have, and they're fatal for this war. They believe that loyalty to the crown is deeper and wider in the colonies than it actually is. They believe that force, including firepower, will quell this insurrection. And most interesting to me, they believe that if the American colonies are permitted to slip away, if the colonies are lost to the empire, that then the Irish will rebel and they'll slip away, and then Canada, and then the Sugar Islands and the West
domino
Indies.
effect.
It's exactly right. It's the domino effect. It's not implausible, but it's quite wrong.
Were there any major surprises in terms of what you found out about King George's views on the colonies and even his actions that we just didn't know before because we hadn't had access to his papers?
First of all, what I see, and has not always been captured by histories of the period, he's driving the train. Under the British system that has been adopted after 1688, the king is required to consult with Parliament and with both houses of Parliament and with his ministers, and there are restrictions on him. He is not an absolute monarch by any stretch of the imagination, but he is really the force behind this effort to quell the insurrection. His prime minister, called first minister in those days, Lord North, was a childhood friend of his, very capable guy, extremely good politician when it comes to handling Parliament. He has no appetite for the war. He's just not a war minister. And George is the one who's constantly bucking him up. So one of the things that I think we can see in this history that I've written is that George is really his own war minister. He is the one who has determined the larger policy. He's affirmed it. He's stuck with it. Despite the setbacks, despite the loss in blood and treasure, the British are bleeding badly, literally, in this war. And yet he wants to stay the course for reasons that have to do with whether or not he's going to be presiding over an empire or not.
Given the fact that this war was really the foundation of this country, it's remarkable to me how tenuous most Americans' grasp is of like what actually happened. I mean, in our minds, I think many people think, well, 1776, it was over. When I was growing up, you got your notions of the American Revolution from Schoolhouse Rock, from Rockin' and a Rollin'.
It's not all wrong.
And now, people probably get it from Hamilton. This is a kind of big question, but how different is that sort of popular cultural imagination of what the revolution was versus the reality?
Yeah, well, first, Hamilton is fantastic. I mean, it's a work of genius. And if anyone is brought to the American Revolution via Hamilton, good for Lin-Manuel. I think that most people don't realize what a struggle it is, that how there are 100,000 smallpox deaths in North America between 1775 and 1782. That's not part of the war itself, but it gives you an idea of the depth of misery. Smallpox is a terrible, terrible thing. The bloodiness of it doesn't end in 1776. That's just the beginning. There are going to be many fits and starts and ups and downs between now and then. And Washington comes within a chin whisker of losing the war repeatedly. And The Civil War qualities of it, I think, are something that we need to understand and appreciate.
It wasn't us versus them; it was us versus.
It was us versus us to some extent, and the extent to which loyalists and even those who were kind of fence straddlers about whether they favored armed rebellion, they were treated dreadfully. You were subjected to confiscation, to public shaming, to jail. Loyalists who were placed on scows in the Hudson River just below Albany under terrible conditions, kind of Abu Ghraib conditions. There was a former copper mine in Connecticut, and Loyalists would be lowered by windlass 70 feet down into these rock-walled cells known as hell. That kind of behavior toward our fellow Americans is something I think we should be aware of. First of all, it gives an indication of the depth of feeling. Mm-hmm. John Adams said, I would have hanged my own brother had he taken part with our adversaries during the war, and that was pretty widespread.
So it wasn't a clear cut, the colonists versus the British. You also had the divisions internally between the Loyalists and the Patriots, and then added layers, right? Because you were already seeing some broader differences between the North and the South, as well as between individual colonies.
Let's not forget, 2.5 million people in 1776, 500,000 of them are black slaves.
So 2.5 million people. To what extent was the population? I mean, obviously, there were no Gallup polls, but do we have a rough sense of how many among that population were Loyalists, were Patriots, were engaged in any way? I imagine that some people sort of went on as is.
And tried to, for sure. A lot of people tried to go on as is, as is the case in any fraught circumstance. John Adams, long after the war, in the 19th century, said that 1/3 were loyalists, 1/3 were kind of indifferent and tried to stay out of it, and 1/3 were rebels. That's not correct, and that has been misunderstood. Modern scholarship indicates that the number of rebels, the percentage of rebels, was probably about 18% of the white population. Now, loyalty is a very flexible notion. So you may be loyal to the crown one day when the king's soldiers are in your backyard. When they go away and your rebel friends come over and lean on you, you're probably going to be less inclined to espouse loyalism. And so that's an important factor in the fluidity of the human terrain, to use a patriotism. The fluidity of political affiliation is an important part of what's happening in the war.
This is the first volume in an intended trilogy, the Revolution Trilogy. How do you work on each volume? Do you set out an outline for the entire 3 books before you start working? And did you think of this book as not just divided in terms of the time frame, but also perhaps a driving question or theme?
First of all, I do the research disparately. So I did the research for this. I did not do the research for subsequent. I pick up thread here and there. I don't have a thesis. I'm a narrative writer. I'm not somebody who's got an argument to propel forward or another argument to knock down. I'm looking at character. I mean, I'm interested in character. And I'll have characters, as I did with World War II, who will be with me for all 3 books. Mm-hmm. And understanding how they change, how they evolve, how they devolve, how they grow, or how they don't grow is important to me. So I'm looking from the beginning to fasten on to those people who are going to be my fellow travelers all the way through. Some of them are obvious, like Washington. He's the long pole in the tent. He's unavoidable, and he's fantastic. He's like Eisenhower was for me World War II. I lived with him for 15 years, feel like I know him pretty well, admire him very much. And then others I pick and choose. Nathaniel Greene, a Quaker anchorsmith from Rhode Island who has really no martial background and becomes one of the great military figures in American history. He's fascinating to me, how he's got the natural ability to lead other men in the dark of night, which is what you're looking for when you're fighting a war. And so, the story is the story, but I'm looking for brushstrokes of detail that help bring characters to life and help bring scenes to life, little flecks of gold.
You're a journalist, and you had the advantage with World War II to have access, in some cases, to people who participated in the war themselves or were one step away from that. Here, obviously, everyone is dead. And so does your choice of characters, to some extent, especially when you're talking about the lesser-known ones, depend on the kind of paper trail that they left behind?
Of course, and women, indigents, people of color, they tend not to leave much of a mark on history. And it's important to be aware of that. And I look for opportunities to draw those folk into this story because it is their story and therefore it's our story. It's harder because the founders leave enormous paper trails and they're fabulous and they're archived and curated. And so I'm aware of this problem. It's a problem for any narrative historian writing about something that happened 240 years ago. I'm always looking for interesting women because they cast a light on it in different ways. Abigail Adams is the smartest of the whole bunch. She has a big brain. She writes beautifully. She has great insights. And I would like about a dozen Abigail Adams to go with me when we go forward.
There are certain periods of history that continue to fascinate Americans who are interested in that kind of thing. And the Civil War is an obvious one, and World War II is another obvious one. And for some reason, the American Revolution in general kind of isn't. I mean, compared to the number of books about Lincoln published in a given year, you don't have nearly as many looking at that colonial period. I'm curious if you have a theory as to why that might be.
There's a very fine historian at the University of Michigan for years named John Shai, and he talks about how most of the significant events in American history, the Civil War and World War II, he mentioned specifically, have a tragic, two-sided quality to them where revolutionary events seem to lack that, and they're kind of smoothed over, they're buffed down. I think part of the issue is that the founders are embalmed in reverence. They're marble and they're on plinths, and we don't really see them for the flawed creatures that they are. George Washington could never tell a lie, but boy, could he prevaricate. He's not a very good battlefield general. I think trying to understand them, warts and all, and for someone like a Washington to see how great responsibility enlarges him helps to make them more real and helps to give them dimension. And my ambition is to make you feel like you really know them, that you are with them in that period. Not only the guys at the top, but all the way down through the ranks and out in the country.
Well, if anyone can do it, I'm sure it is you. Rick, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Pamela.
Rick Atkinson's new book is called The British Are Coming, The War for America, Lexington to Princeton, 1775 to 1777, the first volume in the Revolution Trilogy. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Brenda Wineapple is here to talk about her new book, The Impeachers, The Trial of Andrew Johnson and the Dream of a Just Nation. Brenda, thanks for being here.
Thanks for inviting me.
The easy assumption when you see a title like this is going to be, oh, she's writing this about today, in fact. However, I know that that's wrong because you've been working on this book for a number of years.
6 years, actually. I began it deep in the Obama administration when people heard what I was working on, and they said, and they kind of moved away and talked to someone else because they didn't think it was at all relevant, topical, or even interesting, and nobody really knew very much about it, which is why I started it. I had no idea what was going to happen politically.
Well, you've written history books and you've written literary history books. Your book before that was Ecstatic Nation, Confidence, Crisis, and Compromise, 1848 to 1877. So you were in this period and in the 19th century.
Right. I've been in the 19th century for a while. In some ways, it's easier than the 21st century. And actually working on the last book, Ecstatic Nation, was what prompted this book. It came really out of it because I realized when I was writing what was a very long history before, during, and after the Civil War, including Reconstruction, that I actually knew very, very little about the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. And what I figured was that if I knew very little, and I'm relatively well-informed and relatively literate, and I've been around the 19th century for a while, that probably other people didn't know very much about it. And I was surprised, and have been surprised, that it was an event, I think a major event in American history, that really has been swept more or less aside.
Well, not only do very few people know much about the impeachment itself, but people don't really know or think about Andrew Johnson, the man.
I know. It's interesting to me because even today in the paper was an article about Andrew Jackson. And in fact, while I was working on the book, a lot of people thought Andrew Jackson was Andrew Johnson and vice versa. And actually, in terms of the present day, I've heard or seen Donald Trump compared to Andrew Jackson, which I always thought was interesting and a little bit odd because really, if you want to make comparisons, it's Johnson, not Jackson.
Right. Well, okay, now here's another Johnson comparison, which is that, like Lyndon Johnson, Andrew Johnson was also what we call an accidental president. He became president as a result of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. But before we get to that, let's talk about how he even got to the vice presidency.
Well, it's an interesting story. Andrew Johnson was the United States Senator from Tennessee, so he was from the South. And during what's called the Secession Winter, 1860 to 1861, when secession is being discussed, Andrew Johnson was the only Southern senator who stood up and denounced secession. And he said that the South and slavery was safer within the Union. And as a result, forgetting the slavery aspect, but as a result of wanting to save the Union, he was actually hailed in the North as a kind of hero. So during the war, he was what was known as a war Democrat. His party was Democratic, but he was for the war and for the preservation of the Union. So Lincoln made him military governor of Tennessee, the part of Tennessee that was still occupied or in the Union. And then when Lincoln was running for his second term, 1864, he decided to so-called what we call balance the ticket and put a person from a different party and also a Southerner on the ticket because he actually was afraid he was going to lose.
So this was to kind of bolster the state of the Union.
Yes, and to increase his chances that he would keep the Oval Office, which he then did. Lincoln, like everybody, miscalculated and didn't think he was going to die. He wasn't altogether fond of Andrew Johnson. Johnson was a hard man for many people to like, but he served his purpose. And in those days, vice presidents were pretty inconsequential.
What was he like as a person? I mean, why didn't Lincoln like him?
Well, for one thing, he either had a cold and took some medicine or had a cold and took some medicine and perhaps some whiskey at the vice presidential inauguration. He got very drunk. He was babbling. He put a sloppy kiss on the Bible. He was what's known now and even then was a demagogue. He loved to give stump speeches. He was almost violent and aggressive on the stump. He was like Lincoln, a self-made man. He was born in a log cabin. He really came from poverty. But
wasn't he sent off as an indentured servant as a child?
He was. It's awful when you think about it. I mean, it's his mother sent him and his brother out as an indentured servant, which is, one step up from slavery, in a tailor's shop. And that's where he learned to read, basically. So in that sense, he was one of those people whose poverty and hardship didn't make him identify with people like him, but rather made him hypersensitive and angry.
Eager to push the next level
below
down.
And the next level below him, of course, were enslaved people. So when Lincoln died, the bullet put him into the office. And then suddenly you have 4 million former slaves now free. And Johnson was not exactly visionary in terms of racial issues, quite the opposite.
I'm interested in this idea of the war Democrats. I mean, effectively, was that like a third party? They must have alienated many other Democrats in the South.
War Democrats were mainly in the North. And, it wasn't, it's in a sense, it's like today because the parties were split, and the split in the Democratic Party, which was largely Southern, was between war Democrats and peace Democrats. And peace Democrats really wanted to end the war, stop the killing, conciliate the South, bring them back in, and, perpetuate what had been going on, which was pretty much slavery. And Lincoln would have none of that. So war Democrats were part of the Democratic Party, but generally you found them in the North.
All right, so Lincoln is assassinated. Johnson becomes our accidental president.
Mm-hmm.
What does he do once he's in office? It doesn't start off terrible, right?
No, and everybody was very hopeful because one of the interesting things is that here you had a terrible, brutal civil war that's, for all intents and purposes, over. Then you have the first ever assassination of the president. So people are terrified, what's going to happen, really. And the good news was that the transition from one president to another was very peaceful, and Johnson kept Lincoln's cabinet pretty much intact, and he seemed to be in line with whatever Lincoln's policies would be. And furthermore, he had been saying, and he said often, treason is a crime and it must be punished. And, so he seemed to everyone to represent a kind of, as I said, easy transition and a kind of continuity, a peaceful continuity. And so even the people who came to loathe and oppose him were, willing to give him certainly the benefit of the doubt. After all, he had been the military governor. He had been Lincoln's vice president. So it started off very smoothly. That was in April. By the summer, things were really going as it were south.
What went wrong?
When Johnson took the oath of office in April, Congress was in recess, and Congress wasn't going to meet until December. So naturally, Congress, which can determine, who sits in Congress, wanted a special session. Johnson said no. And so what that meant is that he was going to take the executive branch and he was going to use his presidential powers to create what was called a reconstruction, which was really more reconciliation.
Mm-hmm. So all of this might fall under what we broadly think of as perhaps an abuse of executive privilege.
Yeah, it got more and more so, but certainly at that particular time, because he was willing to, as I said, conciliate the South and bring back the 11 former Confederate states into the Union. And his position was secession didn't happen because it was illegal. And of course, some of the people opposing him, like Thaddeus Stevens, said, if somebody commits murder, they said it couldn't happen because murder is illegal. It doesn't make any logical sense.
Right.
So the question is, what do you do with these states, and what are the conditions for allowing them to come back into the Union? What do they have to do? And his terms for readmission were very, very lenient.
What were they?
Well, that they had to denounce secession, that they had to accept the 13th Amendment, which was, the abolition of slavery, and that basically Confederates who had served in high-ranking offices during the war were disfranchised, were not allowed to vote, and those who had over a certain amount of money, which would be the highest planter class. But he also opened the door then for pardons, and he began pardoning as many as 100 Confederates a day and allowing them to go back into the state legislatures, which was in a sense reconstructing or sort of putting the South back as it was. And also he began appointing governors to the various states, some of whom had, let's say, dicey backgrounds in terms of racial politics, in terms of abolition, in terms of actually secession. So in a sense, he was reconstituting the South just without slavery. And so what happened in the South was that states like Mississippi and others started passing what's called black codes, which essentially put the former enslaved people back into a kind of slavery.
It's the beginnings of Jim Crow.
Oh, very much so. Very much so.
You mentioned the 13th Amendment. Of course, there were 3 post-Civil War amendments. What was his position on the 14th Amendment?
On the 14th Amendment, he actually went on a speaking tour to try to prevent the states from ratifying it. He was opposed to the 14th Amendment, which is shocking because the 14th Amendment doesn't enfranchise anyone, doesn't give anybody the vote. What it basically does is allow citizenship and due process. Before that, he had vetoed civil rights legislation. The Congress passed this legislation over his vetoes, and that's why we have the 14th Amendment. They thought we needed an amendment in order to make sure that people have due process and legal representation and have all the rights of citizenship.
Since we're talking about these policies, before we even get to the impeachment, I'm going to jump ahead and ask this big question of how much of the blame can we put the collapse of Reconstruction on Johnson?
Well, we can't put the entire blame because, after Johnson's Grant, and Grant really initiated some very positive qualities. And in fact, the collapse doesn't really happen until Grant leaves office and the military is taken out of the South. So we're talking about 1876.
Okay.
But my feeling is this, that Johnson had an opportunity. The country had an opportunity. The war is over, and there's an opportunity to rebuild a country. And the question is, which way is it going to go? And we all know which way it went. But there was real excitement, and there was a real kind of push, a visionary push toward making the Declaration of Independence, sort of front and center, so that all people are to be treated equally.
Well, except women.
Well, women, actually, there were some radical Republicans who did want to enfranchise women, and that was a debate that went on in this particular time. So, women are always on the back burner. This is absolutely true. But nonetheless, the opportunity was there, and that's why I say that the country was really at a crossroads. And what Johnson represented was turning the clock back. And what a number of people, both in and out of Washington, in and out of Congress, really had an idea of the country that now that we can reframe the country, really make it a more perfect union, enfranchise people who had been deprived, not only of their ability to, read and write, but to move, to own property, to marry, all of these things. And they really were very excited about it. And it's very possible if a different man had been in the executive mansion, that could have happened. And we would have a very different, unrolling and unfurling of the 19th century. Because actually the Ku Klux Klan started during this time and a lot of terrorist groups in the South that Johnson really turned a cold eye on. He wasn't really interested in that. And it was essentially endorsing that.
There are contemporary parallels all over the place with this story. I mean, it sounds like it's not, in addition to everything that Johnson did that was wrong, it was really about also a lost opportunity and this sense of momentum that was just
exciting.
Gone.
Yeah. I mean, not everyone, fought the war, thought the Civil War should be fought to free the slaves, but quite a number of people did. And that became the dominant force even for Lincoln, who didn't necessarily, or at least in terms of his, speaking, seemed to say that at the very beginning. But that was the real opportunity. And no one wanted the cause of the war to be betrayed and have all of those people die in vain. And especially because it was such a unique opportunity, really.
So how do we get to impeachment? And maybe even before we talk about that, let's just talk about the concept of impeachment, which I think is still, despite everything, a little bit fuzzy for Americans, let alone for some of our listeners around the world.
Right. You mean the I word.
Yes.
Well, impeachment is a two-pronged process, and that's the first thing I think to understand. And that is the House of Representatives can impeach a president with a 50% vote. But that's not the end of the process. Then the Senate tries the impeached president, and the Senate is presided over by the Chief Justice and needs a two-thirds vote in order to convict the president at that particular point. So that's why, for example, Bill Clinton can be impeached or Andrew Johnson can be impeached, and they were, but they were acquitted by the Senate, so they kept their jobs and they moved ahead, so to speak. At least, it's questionable about Johnson, but in any event. So that's part of the process. The next thing to understand are what are the conditions for impeachment? In other words, what will make the House take that vote? And there are two ways of understanding that, because in a sense, the Constitution, which has built-in impeachment to it, is a little bit vague. It says treason or bribery. That's not so vague. Or high crimes and misdemeanors. That's the vague part.
Misdemeanors especially.
Exactly, because as I've said, and I picked this up from the 19th century, does that mean stealing a chicken, are grounds for impeachment? And it seems not. So it seems that it shouldn't be just a misdemeanor, it should be a high misdemeanor. Mm-hmm. So the language is murky in that sense. And then if you go to the Federalist Papers, one of the conditions is abuse of power, which is much broader. So those are the conditions, but again, they're arguable. So in the case of somebody like Andrew Johnson, there were, increasingly, it was clear to many, many people, particularly what's called radical Republicans as part of the Republican Party that was more what we'd call today progressive than the rest. And they were saying Johnson is defying Congress. He's degrading Congress. He's insulting Congress. When he goes out on his stump speeches, he says things like Representative Stevens or Senator Charles Sumner should be hanged. I mean, these are ridiculously awful things to say. It's basically calling for their execution. Mm-hmm. And he's usurping the function of Congress if he's taking over legislative prerogatives in terms of who comes back in. So there's increasing animus against Johnson, and people are thinking he's just unfit to be president. So the impeachment process starts very slowly, actually.
How partisan was it? I mean, the radical Republicans are obviously leading the charge, closely aligned with overlapping the abolitionists and other Republicans. I mean, were there Democrats in the North? I'm assuming not in the South, that were also saying, hey, this is just, for whatever reasons, if not ideological reasons, just in terms of what he's actually done, this is too much?
Not so much the Democrats, no. But the Democrats at that particular point, and they're not the same Democrats as today. They're sort of reversed. Yes. I just want to make that clear. But in any event, they're not in the majority. The Republicans are in the majority.
They hold the Senate and the House.
They hold the Senate and the House, and they actually increased their majorities in the election of 1866. But they themselves are divided. Everybody's divided all the time. And they're divided sort of in three camps, more or less, conservative, moderate, and what's called radical. The radicals are pushing. The moderates are in between. The conservatives, not so much, as you might expect. So the radicals are, especially some extreme ones, call for the impeachment early in 1867. Even many of the radicals thought that was too early. But what happens then is that the investigation goes into the Judiciary Committee. We've all heard of that. And they begin investigating, what Johnson may have done, if there were infractions of law. And in a sense, at that time, it was a way of burying the whole issue. Just put it off in a committee we don't have to deal with.
Call for an investigation.
Investigation. And then the Judiciary Committee votes against impeaching Johnson. But they continue their investigation because he continues to be abusive. He continues to ignore Congress. And in some sense, he's held responsible. He's complicit, it's said, in massacres that are occurring in many of the southern states against Black people and white loyalists, what I call white loyalists. So the Judiciary Committee then changes its mind and votes to impeach, but the House still won't do it. So this is a long process when you think about it. We think, oh, my God, it happened. They voted to impeach him, had a trial. But it actually was much slower than that. And it's interesting.
How long was that process?
Well, it was about a year. And what's interesting about it is it's very deliberate. In other words, to me, and I think others in the 20th and 21st century thought, oh, these crazy people, they were out to get this guy, and they voted to impeach him. Not so much. It was really slow. It was a slow burn. They were very, very careful. And in a sense, they wanted to use impeachment as a cudgel, to keep Johnson in line. It didn't work. It was a court of last resort. What finally happened was Johnson actually violated a law. And once he did that, and that really is thumbing your nose at Congress, then the House voted overwhelmingly to impeach him.
What was the law?
The law was something called the Tenure of Office Act, and that became problematic because that law was of dubious constitutionality. And even the law that it was passed to protect the War Secretary, Edwin Stanton. And when it was first proposed, even Stanton thought it was unconstitutional. But it was passed because Stanton needed protection. And
against Johnson, who wanted to fire him.
Johnson was firing a lot of people because that was his way of making sure the laws that were being enacted by Congress, they're called the Reconstruction laws, that they in fact, weren't carried out. So Stanton and the military was supposed to carry them out in the South, and register black people to vote, protect the polls. Stanton was protecting the military, so Congress wanted to protect Stanton. So this law said that anyone who's confirmed by the Senate, their firing has to be also confirmed by the Senate.
So we're going to skip over the entire impeachment, which will give people plenty of reason to read the book. One of the interesting things about this is that the historiography of our understanding, our approach to Johnson and the impeachment has really shifted like 180 degrees.
Amazing,
right?
Isn't it?
I mean, talk a little bit about how John F. Kennedy viewed the one person in the Senate, the one Republican who voted against impeachment. He was a profiling courage.
He had a whole chapter. His name was Edmund Ross and John Kennedy in Profiles in Courage in 1957. And it was a reigning view. And the
height of the civil rights movement. I mean,
it was it was during that. But what was interesting about that was that no one thought that race or slavery was the issue. What everybody thought, what I was told, in high school and beyond, was that the impeachment was a power grab by a group of Republicans, radicals, crazy people who wanted to make sure that they had the reins of power.
So it was like a petty partisan act.
Petty partisan act by real fanatics, and basically the point of view came right out of or was embodied in the birth of a nation. I mean, that was what it was about. And so the whole issue of race and slavery was, to my mind, buried. And it certainly wasn't mentioned in Kennedy's book. So Edmund Ross becomes a profile in courage because he's the Republican who stands up and is the deciding vote to keep Johnson in office. And so Kennedy is applauding, or Ted Sorensen, whoever wrote the book, is applauding, that act as someone who protected the office of the presidency against these power-hungry who wanted to grab the throne. So that was the view. And it's a satisfying view, I guess, because you've got the single hero who mounts the barricades. But it's so incredibly wrong. And it's not until, I think, civil rights movement and the movements in the 60s when you have a lot of historians beginning to reconsider Reconstruction and look at what might have happened. But even with that and all the wonderful work they've done, they really didn't go into the impeachment so much because Johnson is kind of a blip. Nobody, people sort of think, well, go from Lincoln, major president, to Grant. And it's
right.
almost as if that's how it went.
Well, that's the way it's taught in many middle schools and even high schools today.
So, and you have 3 whole years when the country is, in a sense, still bleeding, and you want to put a Band-Aid on it, really. And that's what Johnson wanted to do, when other people think you can cauterize, you can actually do surgery, you can, change things. So, and to my mind, it really was a racial issue. It really was slavery. And you have Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, who after the vote is taken and Johnson is acquitted, said, this has been the last battle with slavery. And in a sense, we've lost. And what Thaddeus Stevens said is, we're going to pay the price for American history if we don't do something. And I think, sadly, that's been the case. But it wasn't taught that way because I think, as you mentioned, because of Jim Crow, which kind of lasted. It wasn't just the end of the 19th century. It went way into the 20th century.
So jumping ahead one more time, you have been working on this book for 4 years when the election of 2016 comes along, right?
And I'm still at my desk.
still working on it. And suddenly, I imagine, it goes from, oh, yes, Brenda's working on another 19th century book to
boring.
Right. to, post-2016 election where many people in Congress and around the country, largely on one side, the Democratic side, although to some extent on the other, start talking about impeachment with regard to our current president.
Right.
Did people suddenly say, oh, wow, really interesting subject you're working on there?
I had a friend who called me a witch, said that I must be a witch to know this. And in fact, when I was still working, obviously, on the book, 2016, during the primaries, it looked like if anybody was going to be impeached, it would be Hillary Clinton. So it was a shock. And even then, after the president is elected, still impeachment seemed to people a bridge too far. I mean, what would he have to do? But now what's interesting to me are the debates that are going on about a narrow versus a broad definition of impeachment, and what it takes and what you need in order to get people on board if that's what you want to do.
Right. And also just how hard it is to convict. But I would imagine that at a certain point, when you were working on this even under Obama, that most people today, or at least before 2016, their contemporary reference for impeachment was Clinton.
Yes.
In which the sides were largely flipped and most Democrats were saying, oh, no, how could we have gotten here?
Well, what was interesting about Clinton was impeached by the House. It was on a narrow view of impeachment. In other words, he perjured himself. That's breaking the law. You're not supposed to do that. When it went to the Senate, he was acquitted on a broad view because what he did is revolting as it might have been in the Oval Office. Nobody denied that or that he lied about it. But did it really change the presidential office? Did he really abuse? He abused his power over a woman, but did he abuse his power nationally? And that was the argument. So it's interesting. The other thing people talk about is the near impeachment of Nixon. Nixon was not impeached. So it's only Clinton that is looked at. Johnson kind of got forgotten. And it's amazing, really, to me, because so much of what we think about and could learn about today is really buried in that 1868
So you're a
trial.
historian. You're working on this long-term project. The election happens. Suddenly it seems very contemporary. In your own mind and in your approach to bringing this project to completion, I mean, did that infiltrate your thinking?
Well, it would be naive and unbelievable if I said it didn't. But, I really tried to keep blinders on and, in a way, dealing with the 19th century and disappearing into it insofar as I can is very consoling to me. So I obviously read the news. You can't escape the news and the anxiety and the 24-hour almost, drumbeat of something going to happen every minute. I'm obviously aware of that, but to me, the 19th century is a place to go for a solace and to learn things. And so also what's interesting about it, perhaps I shouldn't admit this, is that I can't do anything about the 19th centuries. And also I'm interested in motivations, so that was helpful.
You can do something and that you can help
I can
us
reveal
our
it,
understanding
exactly.
of the 19th century.
But I can't change the vote.
That's right. Well, even the 20th century, crazily enough, seems almost soothing compared to today in some ways.
Well, there's that too, yeah.
Brenda, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Pamela. My pleasure.
Brenda Wineapple's new book is called The Impeachers, The Trial of Andrew Johnson and the Dream of a Just Nation. Alexandra Alter joins us now to talk about what's going on in the literary world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
You got to meet with an interesting author this week.
I did, yes. I had the rare opportunity to interview Thomas Harris, who actually hasn't given an extensive interview since the 1970s, I learned from his agent.
It's like 40 years? More than 40 years.
More than 40 years. And before he even became famous for creating Hannibal Lecter, who has been called one of our most terrifying literary monsters by Stephen King and others. So we had a lot to talk about. We spent about 6 hours together in Miami. I was incredibly nervous to meet him, not merely because he is so reticent and I felt a lot of pressure to accomplish a lot in the interview, but also because of his books. I mean, Hannibal Lecter is probably the scariest character I've ever read. Of course, he's famous for Silence of the Lambs, but he was first introduced in Harris's second novel, Red Dragon, and he is a cannibal and a serial killer, but also kind of a charming, charismatic figure. So he became more of a pop culture icon even than simply a character. Of course, spawned an entire film franchise, a TV series.
You know, I had forgotten that movie, The Silence of the Lambs, was won Best Picture. It won 5 Academy Awards,
yes,
I think.
It swept the Academy Awards. And so I wanted to talk to Harris about that and other things. And one of the incredible things he told me was that he actually didn't see the movie until 2 years after the Academy Awards.
Wait, why?
He had been kind of down on the movies, as he put it, because of a 1986 film called Manhunter, which was an adaptation of Red Dragon. So he hadn't bothered to watch it. And then one night he said he went out to dinner and had some drinks and came home and turned on the TV to check the weather and landed on a cable channel. And he said the dialogue was very familiar. So he sat down and watched it and loved the movie, became friends with the filmmaker Jonathan Demme. They traveled to Haiti together. I thought it was a kind of remarkable story about just how isolated he's kind of been from this phenomenon.
How did he manage to sit it all out, and why?
This is a great question, and one that I asked him about. So he was able to avoid promoting his books. He doesn't give signings, he doesn't give readings, he doesn't give interviews, and I got different explanations for why. His agent told me that he felt he'd been misrepresented in one of his earlier interviews and just decided, you know what, I don't have to do this, I don't like doing this, and I won't. Other people had speculated, other journalists and biographers who'd written about him and academics, that he bristled at these questions he would get about, where do you come up with these dark characters and scenarios? Is there something sort of twisted about your brain?
What's wrong with you?
Exactly. And I asked him about that, and he said no.
Wait, did you ask him what's wrong with you?
I asked him about being asked about that, and he said no. I've never minded that question. It's something people ask you when they can't think of anything else to say, which I thought was a little bit pointed, but probably true. And that wasn't the reason he said that he stopped giving interviews. He said he really wanted the work to stand on its own, and he felt like he was fortunate to not have to submit to that. This was a different scenario for him, though. It was his first novel in 13 years and his first novel in more than 40 years that didn't feature Hannibal Lecter. So I think he felt kind of obligated to go out and say something about it, why he had changed direction. I mean, he's 78 now, and he's sort of starting a new chapter of his career. And the new novel, Kari Mora, is very personal to him. It's the first time he's written extensively about Miami, where he's lived for 30 years. And he wanted to write about new immigrants to Miami and the plight of immigrants and refugees. And it's still a thriller, very much a Thomas Harris type thriller. But it does center on this woman named Kari Mora, who is a refugee from Colombia and experienced, incredible hardship and violence there, and then suddenly finds herself caught up in these dueling criminal networks that are both trying to get this gold out of Pablo Escobar's mansion. So there is the thriller aspect, the heist aspect of it, but he also writes about her anxiety about losing her temporary protected status and not sort of having full rights and everything that come with citizenship. So it was, he did say it was deliberate effort to sort of address this subject in this political climate. It's something that he said has been weighing on him, kind of living in Miami in the middle of the immigration and refugee crisis.
But what's he like? Is he dark and scary? Is he actually a jolly fellow?
He is incredibly gracious and kind and warm and seemed totally at ease, which was very surprising to me. I mean, there were some questions where, he gave me sort of short but polite answers.
Like, what didn't he want to talk about?
Well, I think, when we talked about his long silence and why he was deciding to break it, he did say, well, my publisher asked me to give an interview.
They're making me do it.
Yes. He said they didn't have to twist his arm too much. And I think the one time I was sort of pressing him about the fact that his career has been defined by Hannibal Lecter, when really his favorite character is Clarice Starling. She's the FBI agent that goes toe-to-toe with Hannibal Lecter.
The Jodie Foster character,
exactly,
for movie watchers.
And in this novel, he has another strong female protagonist who is also extremely tough and self-reliant, and yet, he's known for this character that he's always felt a little uncomfortable with. I mean, he's written about Hannibal Lecter as kind of haunting him and feeling like Hannibal Lecter was watching him. So I asked him about that, and he said, it's ironic, isn't it? And then I sort of asked him to say a bit more, and he said, you know what? Alexandra, I don't think about it. When I said, how do you feel about being more famous for this character than anything else you've done? He also had a different kind of approach to the Hannibal character than his agent had. His agent was talking about the fact that you've seen the audience decline for these books. I mean, they were sort of huge in the 90s, and then the Hannibal character has kind of lost some of its luster. The last film didn't do very well. The TV series was well-reviewed, but was canceled.
What was the last film?
The last film was Hannibal Rising, I believe. That didn't do well at the box office or critically. And then the last novel also didn't sell very well compared to his earlier ones and what they were expecting. So I think there's this sense of this character is played out, but Thomas Harris has a very kind of interesting relationship with his characters. He sort of thinks of them as existing independently from his imagination, sort of going about their lives. So he was open to more Hannibal stories. He said if the character sort of reappeared in his brain and did something interesting.
Wound up on the bus next to him
Exactly.
in Miami. I have to ask one last question, which is for people who have not seen the story online or in print in the New York Times, Thomas Harris poses clutching an opossum.
Yes.
Which is a large rodent that I think many of us would like to stay very far away from. Why was he hugging an opossum?
This is a great question. So we actually met in Miami at this Seabird Station, which is a bird sanctuary on the 79th Street Causeway, and a lot of the novel is set there. And Thomas Harris has a long relationship with this animal rescue organization.
You were going to say with this opossum. They're very close.
He's known the opossum for a while as well. The opossum's name is Bruce, and he's a rescue possum, a very sweet possum.
Well, I'm not totally shocked that Thomas Harris, someone who likes to perhaps spend time with Hannibal Lecter, would also want to spend time with Bruce the opossum.
It's another example of him not being exactly what you'd expect if you only knew him through his fiction.
All right, Alexandra, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Tina Jordan, Greg Coles, and John Williams. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
All right. Everybody has fun-looking books in front of them. I'm going to start with you, John, because you have one of my favorites.
Oh, sure. I don't know exactly why, but I feel like I've started about 10 or 12 books in the last few weeks and haven't finished any. And it's not because I don't like them. I'm just in one of those peripatetic moods. And the one I'm sort of the furthest into, about 150 pages or so, is Christopher Hitchens' memoir, Hitch 22, which was published in 2010 and has a little preface added a year later when he addresses his illness. It's a very soup to nuts sort of autobiography rather than a memoir of just a moment or a few years. He starts with his childhood and schooling. He starts with his relationship with his mother, which is actually, I shouldn't say surprisingly tender, but, Hitchens had this aggressive, very rational public face, very articulate and not very sentimental, it seemed. And in writing about his mom, he doesn't call her mom or my mother. He calls her by her name, Yvonne. But other than that, he almost has this he's still locked into this almost boyish affection for her. And it's very touching. And she died in a very dramatic way. She had taken up with a man who wasn't her husband, who she loved and who Hitchens knew about. And then one day he gets a call that she and he apparently committed suicide together, essentially. He thought that she had been murdered and that the man had then committed suicide. But I think it seems in the end that he thinks that she was just deeply unhappy for reasons he didn't quite know, and she was kind of in the grips of this other guy who was depressed. The writing, as you would imagine, is very smart, and his personality comes through in it, both his sort of pomposity, he's constantly referencing different things about his education and his early political beliefs, but it does show a side of him, I think, that will surprise people.
The thing I liked about that, well, I like many things about that book, but one amusing thing is that book has exactly one thing in common with one of his best friends, Martin Amis's memoir, Experience, which is they both tell the same anecdote about Kingsley Amis, Martin's father. And I can't say this on the podcast in full because it is not family language. But apparently Amis's dog could issue like a very nasty expletive-filled insult as a bark, and Kingsley could imitate this, and they both told that story. And of course, you can see why, because it's a really good story.
Well, I'm not quite there yet, so I'm glad you can't say it on air.
Another talking dog this week.
And your book is not about a talking dog, Greg.
No, mine is not. In my personal reading, I incline toward fiction and poetry. But this week, a big biography has its hooks in me. I'm reading Our Man by George Packer, which is a biography of the diplomat Richard Holbrooke, who was Assistant Secretary of State. He was never Secretary of State. And I think one reason that I'm really enjoying this book is that it reads like a novel. It's very much a character study. It's a voicey biography. Packer, he's a really reputable, estimable journalist, a longtime staff writer at The New Yorker, now at The Atlantic, and very capable of writing the kind of remote, removed journalistic voice. But in this book, he's adopted what feels like it might be Holbrooke's voice himself. There's kind of this jazzy, swingy, loose-limbed narrative voice telling you about Holbrooke. And Holbrooke is this infuriatingly ambitious, whirlwind, brilliant, but kind of nakedly working the room always, a character who is just kind of always grasping. And Packer has a good line about how he's incredibly insightful about everything except for himself. He has no self-knowledge at all. And the line is something like you could ask him to explain President Obama to you, and Holbrooke would go on for an hour and a half, and then you could say, and what do you think that Obama thinks of you, or what do you mean to Obama? And Holbrooke would just kind of give you this dead-eyed stare that the question meant nothing to him. There's a character in here, Polly Wisner, one of the great Georgetown hostesses. She was married to the Washington Post columnist Frank Wisner. And Holbrooke ingratiated himself to her at these dinner parties that she would throw, kind of charting the course of American diplomacy. And Packer has this line, she would talk affectionately about that Holbrooke as if he were the raffish young hero of a 19th century picaresque. And this book feels like that. It's the red and the black, the kind of social climbing in service of his ambition. So that's what I'm reading this week. Tina, how about you?
I'm reading something different for me. I'm reading Birds by the Shore by Jennifer Ackerman. You may remember the book she had a few years ago called The Genius of Birds, which I loved. I think most people in the desk know that I'm a bird watcher. I didn't actually know about the existence of this book. It was written in 1996. Its subtitle is Observing the Natural Life of the Atlantic Coast, and it's a memoir of the 3 years she spent living in a small coastal town in Delaware. It's got the same kind of beautifully observed scenes that those of us who read Genius of Birds loved so much. I mean, whether she's walking on tidal flats or marshes or the beach itself, she's the kind of person who's paying attention not just to the color of the sea, but the bark, the grass, everything. I wanted to actually read the opening lines so you could see what I meant, because they're exceptionally pretty. I live in a small town by the sea. Summer mornings, salt air sifts through the screen on my open window. Companies of gulls settle on my rooftop or sail around the church steeple across the way. On gray days, the foghorn out in the harbor bleats like a cow deprived of its calf. One is always aware of the sea in Lewes, can feel its broad, enduring presence just over the fat humps of sand dunes. It affects people as surely as it breeds rhythms into the fiddler crab. It does have a new introduction, which I read. Interestingly, there's been so much science, so much bird science since she wrote this book, that a number of these essays do seem to be outdated, but she addresses that.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Pamela, what about you this week? You have something open.
Yes, it's not pretty, unlike Tina, but it is totally excellent. And it's the kind of book that not only do I want to recommend it to everybody, but it's the kind of book where even if you're sitting next to a stranger on the train, you just want to elbow them and say, look, I don't care what you're doing. I just have to read this out loud to you. And so it's difficult not to share it with everyone in your circle. I feel like I've been very restrained among all of you.
Now I need to know what book this is.
This book is Betty McDonald's The Plague and I. Longtime listeners may remember a while back I read The Egg and I. if people are familiar with her name, it's probably because of the Mrs. Pigglewiggle books, her children's books, which are still in circulation. These were reprinted by the University of Washington Press. I think may have gone out of print. But The Egg and I was about, as a firsthand account, a memoir of her moving to rural Washington and becoming a chicken farmer, an egg farmer, even though she hated chickens. And that was a really funny book that led to the character's mom, Pa Kettle, which later on became like a TV show, apparently. The Plague and I followed a few years later. This book came out in 1948, and it's also a memoir. And the circumstances are not funny, which is that, Betty McDonald came down with tuberculosis in the era of like when it was like consumption. It must have really been on the cusp of when the right antibiotics were developed to treat it, and maybe they just weren't widespread. But where Betty McDonald was, there were not the right antibiotics. So instead, you were sent to a sanatorium, and like the medical descriptions of what they believed at the time, it's enough to physically nauseate you. Like, and the things that they did, which were to deliberately like collapse your lungs and just do these brutal surgeries that you're like, that could not have been helpful when you read about it. But the book is extremely comic. It's so well written. It's just really, really funny. And I'm going to read aloud a section from a chapter called My Operation. A lot of what she writes about are the characters in the sanatorium, the people she had to share rooms with. I think my favorite character is this woman, Kimmy, who's a Japanese-American woman, apparently incredibly tall, and therefore feels like she's ostracized from her own. She's like refers to herself as a giant, and she's incredibly mordant, this Kimmy character. But the chief villain is probably the charge nurse who's in control of the operation. And everyone, almost everyone who works at the sanatorium is terrible. So this is a chapter, and the rules are so stringent. This will give you a sense. This chapter is called My Operation. On January 6th, the charge nurse invited me to the Pines Moving Picture Show, but she handed me the invitation so thickly encased in rules, it was like being given a present of one smelt wrapped in the Sunday New York Times. She said in part, "You are on the list to go to the movie tonight, Mrs. Bard. You may wear makeup if you wish, but you may not talk or laugh. You are to be ready by 7 o'clock in your robe and slippers with your pillow and night blanket. You will be called for by a male." She said male in a low, throbbing voice, as though it were some dangerous new sex. "Ambulant patient, but you are not to speak to or to laugh with your escort. Your temperature and pulse will be taken as soon as you return to bed, and if your temperature or your pulse has increased, you will not be allowed to go to the next moving picture show." I thanked her, promised not to speak or to pulsate, and she left. When she had gone, I dug down under the thick, depressing wrappings and found that my little present was still there. I was going to the movie. I was going to leave my bed and spend a perfectly delightful evening losing myself in the lives of people who had nothing to do with tuberculosis. I hoped that the picture would be either a musical extravagant in Technicolor or a gangster picture with lots of shooting and screaming tires, but I didn't really care if it turned out to be a travelogue or something starring Rin Tin Tin. It was a movie, and I was going to it, and it would be my first strong step toward normal living. So that just gives you a sense, but everything. She's so good with words, and the circumstances again of this kind of it's like it feels like another. I guess it was another century. It was 1948, but it feels like 4 centuries away. And they had to lie in bed, and they were not allowed to sit up, and they were not allowed to talk, and they were not allowed to laugh, and they were not allowed to read. It just sounds excruciatingly boring.
Not allowed to have a pulse.
That's right. And yet she has written very entertainingly about it. So I highly, highly recommend Betty McDonald's The Plague and I. And that is all from me. Let's go through your books again, Tina.
I read Birds by the Shore by Jennifer Ackerman.
I'm reading Our Man by George Packer.
And I'm reading Hitch 22, a memoir by Christopher Hitchens.
And that is all. Thanks, guys.
Thanks
Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, albeit not right away. The Book Review Podcast is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media with the great help of my colleague, Don Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.